Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel, Alok Sharma, a minister under Theresa May, promoted to the cabinet by Boris Johnson, then appointed Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in February, just a matter of weeks before lockdown. Labour's Shadow Secretary for Northern Ireland, elected to Westminster 5 years ago at the age of 27. She's been a member of the Shadow Ministerial team ever since, Louise Haigh. Ed Davey, anointed this year as the new leader of the Liberal Democrats, replacing Joe Swinson, formerly Energy and Climate Change Secretary in the 2010 coalition government under David Cameron. Joining us down the line from Edinburgh, Devi Sridhar, Professor of Global Public Health at Edinburgh University and a member of the Scottish Government's Coronavirus Advisory Committee. And we're just after 10 p.m, so after closing time now, founder and boss of pubs and restaurant chain Oakman Inns, Peter Borg Neal. Good evening. Welcome to my guests here in the studio and, of course, to Devi. Thank you very much for joining us down the line. And we have our live audience with us again, virtually this evening. You're all from Chingford. So, hello. Very good to have you with us. Let's hear what you've got to say. And for everyone watching at home, for all of you, of course, you can join in the conversation as well on social media at BBC Question Time. Let's hear what you have to say as well. Let's get going with our first question tonight, which is from Sinem Ishleg.
Hi. How does the new job support scheme help those who still have their industry shut or massively reduced because of the pandemic?
So, of course, we heard about the new job support scheme today from the Chancellor. Louise.
Well, it was really welcome to see the Chancellor announce some of the measures today. Labour has been calling for several months now for the furlough scheme to be extended in a targeted, specific way in order to address exactly the industries that you've just mentioned, those industries that are still not able to be back up and running because of social distancing and lockdown measures. So
do you think this goes far enough in terms of industries who've been shut or massively reduced?
No, I don't. There aren't the measures there for those industries that are not yet viable because the law doesn't allow them to be. There aren't the measures there for people who are self-employed and who aren't able to get back to work. And we have to be honest and recognise that there is a jobs crisis here and now. 750,000 people have lost their jobs already this year. That's 750,000 personal tragedies. And I didn't hear anything from the Chancellor today about retraining or about creating new jobs. And with the measures as they are, not being anywhere near significant enough in order to protect against a second wave of job losses, then I would say increasing unemployment is inevitable.
So just to be clear, Labour would do more, spend more? We
would, yes. We need to see a retraining programme. We need to see targeted, specific support for those sectors. Because quite frankly, Fiona, there's a cost of not doing this, isn't there?
But there's a heck of a cost at the end of it as well.
There is indeed, and that's why the Chancellor is bringing forward some measures. That's why we've already borrowed a significant amount, because this virus, this pandemic is significant. We have to match the scale of action with the scale of the challenge, and we have to acknowledge that as well as saving lives, we have to save livelihoods.
Well, talking of livelihoods, Peter, you run a chain of I'm calling them pubs, but they're rather upmarket pubs and restaurants. So do you welcome this? Do you think it's going far enough? Is it going to help you?
Well, from a personal point of view, our business is doing well, and much of what the Chancellor has done this year has been very, very positive for my entire industry, and certainly very good for Oakman Inns, my business. However, I would urge the Chancellor to look again at some detail and to look at sectors on a kind of granular basis. So just to pick on one example, because there's several parts of the hospitality industry which will continue to struggle. But if you take nightclubs, so, you know...
They've been shut throughout, haven't they?
Yeah, and they're not allowed to open. They've been preparing to open. I spoke to the chief exec of Deltic, big, very professionally run nightclub company today. He's been preparing to open. He's been investing capital. He's kept his team on. He's brought people off furlough to prepare the marketing and to make sure everything's going to be safe and COVID secure.
So this scheme is no use to him?
No use to him at all at the moment, but, you know, I'm hoping that the government will be looking further. You know, they've had to do a lot in a short period of time. But if a business is not allowed to open, it's surely still a viable business afterwards when it can open. So I think you have to separate maybe a business that is never going to succeed again. But, you know, Peter Marks's customers are ready to come back. They want to come back. Now, if the government, for public health reasons, will not allow a nightclub to open, then I guess we can get to understand that. But but there must be support so these businesses are still there to reopen and they're a big part of the economy in due course.
Of course, you talk about nightclubs, you could talk about theatres, live events,
I just took one example.
all sorts of companies, or all sorts of industries rather. Catherine, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I'd just like to agree with what the gentleman's just said about the government maybe needing to look at the industries in a more granular level. My company is a company which provides a day service for adults over 50 with disabilities. My company is closed at the moment, and the clients that we have are not offered any provision and haven't been offered any provision since the lockdown started. Is my company not a viable company? And if so, what happens to these people in the long term? These people now are suffering from, in many cases, being isolated. They don't always have family or friends that can even keep in touch with them. And the day centre was a bit of a lifeline for them. So what happens to them in the future?
Vimal.
I just wanted to ask again, just to reiterate those 2 points there. So what is actually a viable job under the Tory government? Because it just seems such a ambiguous thing. And this is the whole point of what we talk about in clear, concise dialogue with the public. When you say viable job, what do they mean by that?
Kieran.
I think that there's a big problem here that there's going to be a whole generation of people that is just going to be thrown onto the pile of trash by missing out on this scheme. And it's going to really, really damage the economy. It's going to damage the country's future prospects. We're going to be losing all of those future sort of tax revenues that we need to actually start to grow the economy again in another sort of 6 months or 12 months or a couple of years down the line. We're going to need all of these creative industries and the nightclub industries and the social industries that actually drive our UK economy. We're a consumer-led economy, and we need to prop up these industries that actually is going to prop up the long-term recovery of the economy in the future as well.
So, Alok, what do you say to, you've mentioned this speech now, 3 people from the audience. Rishi Sunak made it quite clear this is a support scheme for people with viable jobs. But jobs that aren't viable now, theatres, nightclubs and many others, will become viable again when we're through this. But you're not going to save them.
Well, look, Fiona, I spend every day talking to businesses, business representative organisations, and I know it's actually very difficult for lots of sectors. We completely understand that. I think what you've seen from the Chancellor today is a set of measures which actually have been very welcomed by business. And I think the CBI described them as a decisive set of measures. And if you look at those individual measures, yes, they are there to support people who are coming back into work, but they're also an extension of the loan schemes in terms of the time limits on those, in terms of how long people have to pay back the loans they've taken. And actually, when we talk about individual sectors, Peter and I had this discussion earlier, is that there has been targeted support. So if you look at the hospitality and leisure sector, they have a 1-year holiday when it comes to rates. That's continuing. The Chancellor's announced a set of measures in terms of allowing people longer to pay their VAT deferrals. So there are a whole range of things. And this actually does build also on the almost £200 billion of support, where we've helped 12 million people to stay in work. Now, Louise talked about...
So what about the point that the audience are making, though, that the jobs that aren't viable, the jobs that cannot exist even on a part-time basis at the moment because of the restrictions we're in, obviously the government has imposed on us, those jobs aren't viable now, but they will come back. Are those people just
Well, no. I mean,
just be thrown on the scrap heap, as one of our people was saying.
No, that is not obviously the intention at all.
But isn't that going to be the outcome?
Well, as I said, I think support is available for those. So the furlough scheme is continuing until the end of October.
Yes, but after that?
Well, as I said, if you look at some of those areas, so we talk about the creative industries, there's a £1.5 billion package that's been put forward for that as well. But I think the other part of this, and I think Louise talked about traineeships. So if you look at what the Chancellor announced at his summer statement, there was £30 billion of support, support for green jobs, support for traineeships, support for young people through the Kickstart scheme, support for apprenticeships. So there is a lot that we are doing, one, to support people who are in work now, so they can come back, even if it's for a small percentage of time, but then also ensuring that we are supporting the creation of new jobs and actually helping people to get retrained.
May I make a point about the bank debt? So I spoke to another industry colleague today, and he had agreed a CBIL, which enabled him to keep on funding his business without the help of furlough long enough for when the restrictions are lifted that he could reopen. But of course, it was right at the last stage, and the bank told him today, because of the new government restrictions, we don't think this is a good bet anymore, you won't be getting it. So he is completely stranded now and not sure what to do next. So again, I don't want to be overly critical, Alec. I'm just asking you to go back and look at some specific detail for the, not just my sector, but other similarly affected sectors. There's a difference between a business that is not viable because customers don't want to use it and one that's not allowed to operate, or there are laws that are restricting its operation in such a way that it's sub-economic to operate.
Yeah. If I may just come back on the point about CBIL. So actually, the start of that process, I, the Chancellor and others...
for everyone who's not familiar with that acronym.
Sorry, of course. It's the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme. It's one of the loan schemes that we've introduced. Over 1 million businesses have been supported through that, the bounce back loans and other schemes as well. And what we've been very keen on is to continue to impress upon the banks. They need to support businesses. And I was being very clear in the House, in terms of press conferences that took place at Downing Street, that this is a time for the banks to step up and support. And there is an underwritten guarantee from the government as well when it comes to CBILs up to 80%. So, I mean, I can't comment on individual cases, but the fact that we have seen over 1 million businesses now supported through loan schemes suggests that it is working. But I understand there will be people who will fall through the gaps.
Iqbal.
Hi there. I was just thinking about the term viable business. A friend of mine, he's self-employed. He's a one-man limited company. He wasn't eligible for any help in the furlough scheme, so he's been living off his savings for the last 6 months. Rishi's new scheme is also not going to give him anything. So again, he's got to keep winding down his savings. It just seems very unfair that because he is deemed a non-viable business, that even though he's not claiming benefit and he's always been employed, that he could end up losing his business and having to completely rethink what he does after all this has happened. And yet, in the past, self-employed companies have been able to take grants, even if their own business was booming at the time. It's who decides what is viable?
Well, I mean, if we talk about the self-employment scheme, of
briefly,
course...
because I've got to let everybody else
Of course, I'm so sorry.
No. I mean, who does this? I mean, is Rishi Sunak deciding what's a viable business? Are you deciding?
Well, I think just going back to the point about the self-employment scheme, of course, there is additional support that the Chancellor announced today as well.
But who's deciding what's a viable business?
But in terms of what's viable is, ultimately, it is where businesses are bringing people back to work and they're spending at least a third of their time in employment. And the scheme will work on the basis that you're in work, being paid by your employer for at least a third of the time, and then the rest of the wage bill is effectively shared between you, the employer, and the government.
So it'll come down to whether the company believes it's worth the investment. Richard.
Thanks, Fiona. A question for both Alok and Louise, since they both mentioned retraining. How is that supposed to happen in a socially distanced environment before people get back to some sort of normality? I can imagine apprenticeship schemes and things like that are going to rely more on practical, hands-on, face-to-face contacts and communication rather than being able to do stuff virtually. So it's a question on how training can operate and apprenticeships can operate in this current environment.
Well, because we haven't yet heard from the rest of the panel, I'm going to keep going round. Richard, forgive me. Ed.
Thanks, Fiona. I've been talking to a lot of businesses, a lot of people over the last few weeks and months, and I've never seen the level of anxiety that we've got. People really worried that their businesses are going to fold, that they're going to lose their jobs. And while, like Louise, I welcome some of the packages today, I just don't think it goes anywhere near far enough. Take the example that Iqbal mentioned. There are a lot of self-employed people who got nothing in the previous support package, over 1 million people who are excluded. They're not covered today.
So what would you do differently, Ed?
Well, you should bring them into the self-employment scheme that was there. And it should be more generous. And talking about Peter is quite right. There are a number of sectors. I'd include nurseries. I'd include tourism. sectors that are just not able to operate. And they're viable businesses. And it's just not good enough for the Secretary of State to say they're going to forget them, because why should these businesses, why should these people lose their jobs, lose their businesses because of the random impact of a virus they had nothing to do with? We've got to build back. And I see no long-term strategy for the government. Now, they made a mistake as well. They thought that COVID would be coming over by now, and they introduced something called the Job Retention Bonus, £9 billion, which is going to be paid out at the end of this year. They could have chosen to use that money, instead of this scheme that they thought would be useful now, but put it back into the scheme today. They could have been, therefore, far more generous, included people that I'm talking about who've been excluded and not got the help they need, and it could have run for a lot longer. That's what we've seen in places like Germany and France and Austria, countries who are really getting behind their businesses and helping those who are in real distress. And I'm afraid the government really has failed.
Devi.
Yeah, I do wonder if we're looking at the problem the wrong way, because the idea has been that you have your economic issues here, your public health problem there, and they're in opposition to each other. But if we look at GDP performance for the second quarter of 2020, what you notice is the countries that controlled the virus quite tightly, Taiwan, South Korea, even Finland, Norway, their GDP hit has been minimal, less than 5%. Taiwan looks practically the same economically. And the countries that didn't control the virus, like the United States, the UK, Spain, are taking upwards of 20%, as well as thousands of deaths in the States, hundreds of thousands of deaths. So the question in my mind is, we're entering this new normal of restrictions. Wouldn't it be better instead to actually follow East Asia, follow the model of strong suppression, possibly elimination? Then you get rid of your virus, you have a full domestic recovery, and then we can get back to actually businesses recovering fully. So what I'm hearing from senior economists who I work with is that unless you solve your public health problem, you're not going to solve your economic problems, and we still have a substantial public health problem and economic problem currently.
I think that's exactly right. One of the real problems we've had in this government is they have acted too slowly. They've been inefficient. They've said they're going to have a testing, a trace and isolation strategy, just in the way that other countries have had, working with local government. They've just not done that. Well, look, and that's created the problems for businesses and why we're in the mess we are.
We have got, Alok, forgive me, because we've got a question on that, so I just want to move this on. Iqbal, what's your question?
Hi there. Are the new measures a short step away from full lockdown again, as this is what happened the first time around, with more and more restrictions happening almost every day?
Peter, I'm going to come to you on that, because obviously you were at the sharp end in terms of the effect the restrictions may have and if a full lockdown is just around the corner.
Well, we were relieved that this bizarre kind of circuit breaker idea kind of went away.
You thought it was bizarre?
Yeah, I think, the approach, you have to deal with public health. There's no doubt about that. And, no one should think that business would ever put profits before people's safety, because it's just not true, and certainly not in my industry. And, we've been kind of quite frustrated that the government has felt the need to impose these additional lockdowns. And I'd like to refer back to the shenanigans last week from Matt Hancock, where shenanigans. I mean, he came onto the Radio 4 Today programme. It was about 8:15 last Friday, and tried to imply that the major cause of the increase in transmissions was the hospitality industry. I mean, it's just totally untrue. Very, very misleading. Now, we opened on July the 4th. 8-9 weeks went by, there'd been no significant change in the number of transmissions. And then at the beginning of September, there's a big change. How on earth can that be blamed on the hospitality industry? We're very angry. We want a retraction and an apology. And if we don't get one, this issue will not go away, because people are really, really hurt and upset. We sweated blood to get ready to reopen our businesses. We worked really hard to make our premises COVID secure from day one. Now, I've served 1.5 million people since we've opened. Not one has got COVID. The government's own figures, Public Health England figures, made it very clear that in week 37, which was a week before he spoke, number one arena for transmissions, care homes. Number two, educational settings. Number three, workplace. He even said, we don't believe it's happening in the workplace. It's in hospitality. And then they sent out poor Dominic Raab the other day, And when he was pressed, he kind of said, well, we think it's kind of asymptomatic, so we think it is actually happening, even though our own figures say it's not. I mean, poor old Dominic, I mean, it's not his fault. And, you know, they sent him out to kind of face...
Well, just to be clear,
music.
so the Public Health England figures, as you suggest, for the week to the 13th of September, suggest of 508 confirmed outbreaks, 5% were in food outlets, including restaurants and pubs. Let me just ask you, what do you make of the 10 o'clock curfew? Good idea? Bad idea? Going to drive
I think
any
it's a
pubs out
poor
of
idea,
business?
but not from a business perspective. I'm not too worried. In the sense of my particular business, it's not going to really impact that much. It's just a bit absurd. I mean, I have a vicar that comes to one of our places for supper after evensong every week, and he sort of sits down about 10 to 9, he has something to eat. Now, as I understand it, if the vicar hasn't finished his chocolate souffle at 10 o'clock, I'm going to have to frog march him out the premises. I mean, it's just heavy-handed and silly.
Well,
and
no, hang on a minute.
Dangerous.
No one's suggesting you have to frog no one's suggesting you have to frog march him out. You just have to make it clear at 10 o'clock he has to go.
But really, now, the problem here is that if everyone walks out at 10 o'clock, that's quite dangerous. What you want is a kind of gradual dispersal of people. So I'd encourage the government just to look again at the detail. I don't agree with the curfew, but if there's going to be one, let's do it in a sensible fashion. They referred to Belgium. That's the Antwerp model. That was an 11:30 curfew. And actually, at 11:30, you had to stop serving drinks. And you had time to drink up and leave in a civilised fashion. So it's a poor idea, yeah. And I think they need to look at it again.
Devi, let's just come back to the question specifically. Are the new measures a short step away from a full lockdown again, with more and more restrictions happening almost every few days? Because you're speaking to us from Edinburgh, and you have different restrictions up there. I'm thinking particularly in terms of households mixing.
Yes, the idea was to move early, to move aggressively and try to get a check on it. And we're not even sure these measures will be enough yet to really take a handle, especially as we've had universities returning and a number of outbreaks in students. But I guess the larger point I would make is that we're not going back to 2019. There's no normal anywhere across the world. Every country is living under different kinds of restrictions. So in a way, we need to move away from the lockdown language and get into degree of restrictions. And every country is making a choice. So if you look at East Asia and the Pacific, those countries have said, we want to get back to normal, live music, full sports stadiums, concerts, all the things you can have if you eliminate the virus and you have strong border checks. They've accepted the trade-off. They cannot travel abroad. Then you look at Europe and you are seeing these nighttime curfews, indoor hospitality shut, basically going after riskier settings because you assume the virus is circulating and you're trying to stop super spreading events. But that means you can't have those kind of events because there's too many people become infected. And I guess coming back to it, that we need to have a functional testing, tracing, and isolating scheme. And the latest figures show it's truly a broken system currently. So in a way, there's no other way to suppress the virus than is keeping people away from each other. And the longer the government delays in trying to get that system up and running, the more likely we are to end up in another lockdown. Because if you just let the virus run its course, this is what's happened in Israel. It's the first developed country to go back into a national lockdown. The problem is your hospitals start filling up, your ICUs start filling up, and that 0.6 case fatality rate starts creeping up over 1 or 2% if people arrive at hospital and can't get oxygen, can't get treatment, can't get ventilators. And so governments are kind of forced into a national lockdown because of the healthcare capacity need. And that means all the other services like cancer treatments, surgeries, they get backlogged, and we end up in a repeat of March. And that's what we're trying to avoid by keeping the virus at low levels right now before we get into that really difficult position.
OK, we've got some hands up. Neil.
Hi, thanks. Just to go back to Ed's point, provisionally, benefit of hindsight there, Ed, I think the government are doing quite well. I also don't share the pessimistic views of business at the moment. I'm in the construction industry. We're attempting to build our way out of this crisis, and I think doing very well. I've employed people recently. The construction industry is seeing growth. There are sectors of it that are closing down, but there's also a lot of sectors opening. And also, Debbie, I think the ifs and buts in relation to your last statement don't quite follow through. We're not in the same position we were at the beginning of the year. People are wearing masks. Most business settings, mine in particular, is COVID friendly or COVID safe. And I think lots of people are taking the restrictions very seriously. So I don't see us falling back into this element of doom and gloom that seems to be profiting through.
Alex.
With any new measures, will the government be proactive or reactive in their response? You could argue previously, like in March, the government was quite reactive. They've been quite slow on their response to corona. And I look as a student, as Devi was saying, to students, they can't go to the pubs anymore. They're locked into their accommodation. And I don't want that to happen to me. I'd rather the government be upfront and honest, say what could happen, and put the measures in place before it gets worse, not when it gets worse or after it has happened.
So, Alok, are we likely to see more restrictions?
Well, nobody, Fiona, wants to go into a full lockdown. I mean, that is absolutely clear. What we've done
but
is...
do you think it's likely that more is coming down the track?
Well, what we've always said is that we will continue to monitor this on a daily basis, and obviously, if we need to act, we will. But I think the fundamental point here is that the vast majority of people have indeed followed the rules, and actually businesses have secured their premises. I work with trade unions, with businesses to make sure that we've got the right guidance.
Can I just pick you up on most people?
Yeah.
Because this is something the Prime Minister, Matt Hancock, and yourself this evening have said repeatedly over the last few days, that most people are following the rules. And a recent academic study found that between May and August, only 18% of people self-isolated after developing symptoms, and only 11% were self-isolating after being told they'd been in contact with a confirmed case. I mean, back in April, it was 50%. It wasn't great then either. So what makes you so sure people are following the rules?
Well, actually, since we talk about test and trace, there are almost 500,000 people now who, through that system, have self-isolated, who would otherwise be putting others at risk. So,
and how can you be sure they actually? How can you be sure? I'm just looking at those figures. How can you be sure they actually are self-isolating?
Well, I think you know, they're obviously contacted and they're
I know, but that's very different.
No, I understand that, but I think you know, there is a process to make sure that that happens, and people.
What are they being checked up on?
But if I can give you, let me give you an example. When you're talking about you know, people not necessarily following the rules, I mean, I come into London every day by train, and I've actually seen now, the past few months, people are, by and large, just about everyone is observing the rule to have face coverings on public transport.
But despite those figures, are you confident? Let me just finish. Are you confident then that people who are being told to self-isolate are self-isolating in large numbers?
I think, well, as I said to you, I think if you look at test and trace, a significant percentage of the people who have been contacted as a result of somebody else getting the infection are indeed self-isolating. But there is a fundamental point.
I'm very alarmed. Well, Louise is asking where the evidence is.
Well, there is a fundamental point here also about you know, the position that we're in. I think Neil made a really good point, is that we know a lot more about this virus. We've got a whole set of measures that are in place. Nobody wants to go into full lockdown, but what we need is people to continue to observe the rules and the guidelines, and I do think the vast majority are.
Louise?
Well, look, I mean, the latest restrictions and more advanced lockdown measures are evidence of only one thing, that the virus is going in the wrong direction, and this is a very grave moment for the country. We've had 31,000 cases over the last 6 days, and hospitalisations and the death toll rising again. And I think people are right to ask whether we're back in the same position as we were earlier this year, with the government failing to prepare for a second lockdown. The track and trace system is not world-beating. It's very far from it. Less than 80% of contacts are reliably not being reached every week. It's out. The new figures out today show that 10% of tests are being returned within 24 hours. And these and the track and trace that is being out.
That really is incorrect.
That's the ONS statistics that have been out today. From all testing routes, 10.6% have come back within 24 hours. The track and trace system has been outsourced to companies like Serco, Deloitte, G4S, none of which had any experience in track and tracing, and that's why so few are being reached and even fewer are actually being followed up to make sure they self-isolate. And all of this means that the backbone of a public health response is not there, so we cannot ensure the wider reopening of the economy unless it's there as well. We have lost sight of the virus, and that is why it's now out of control. And do you think, just coming back to the question, that we are just a short step away from a full lockdown? Well, I think until we have that effective public health response underpinning any restrictions, so that's a track and trace system and comprehensive testing, you know, it was utterly inevitable that as schools, universities and workers returned, that testing demand would increase, but the government have not increased testing capacity since the end of June. Mark, you've got your hand up.
I just want to roll back to a point that Peter made about the hospitality and entertainment industry needing to open. And then Debbie made a point about Southeast Asia. They made a trade-off. And by closing their borders and accepting that they couldn't travel, they were able to open up hospitality and entertainment. So if we did that, how would the holiday industry and the travel industry react? You're not going to please everyone all of the time, are you?
Tia?
So I'd just like to go back to what was said about people being checked up on when they come home and asked to self-isolate or asked to self-isolate for other reasons. So I got back from France quite recently and had to fill in the passenger locator form and was told I'd be checked up on. I wasn't once. And I know a few other people who've come back from France as well, or come back from other holidays who haven't been checked up on. And I was self-isolating in London, and I noticed when I came out of self-isolation that people in the shops weren't particularly wearing masks, even people working in the shops. And the same on public transport. I mean, quite a lot of people were, but also quite a few weren't. And I just feel like if we don't put anyone in a position, even just a shop door entrance saying like, oh, would you mind putting the mask on, something like that, it does encourage people to do so. And if no one's checked up on, I mean, it's all very nice that people have to understand that they need to do it. But if no one feels like there are going to be any repercussions, why would they? And I think that's why there are so many people not doing it.
So let me just, I'm sorry, Tia, I interrupt you. Do go on.
I was just going to say, I think it's difficult to expect people to do it if they don't think that there are going to be any repercussions from it. And yeah, I just think that it needs a bit of encouragement and explain the importance, and you're less likely to do it if you feel like other people aren't, and therefore you aren't protected.
So let's just be really clear, and specifically on this point that Tia raises. People who are told to self-isolate, how do you know they're doing it?
Well, there is obviously a follow-up process that takes place. We have people who are doing that.
And how many? No, don't move on to something else. Let's just do this one thing. How many people are followed up?
Well, as
Tia wasn't, as
I've said to you, there are 500,000 people who have been self-isolating through the test and trace system.
And how do you know how many of them actually are self-isolating?
Well,
that's how many are supposed to be. How many actually are?
I mean, there is a follow-up process that obviously takes place.
So does the government know how many are actually doing the self-isolating?
Well, 500,000 people, almost 500,000 people are now through the test and trace system have been self-isolating.
They've been asked to, but do you know if they actually are?
They are indeed self-isolating. But I want to go back to this point about testing. So if I may, because Louise raised this point about testing not increasing. Actually, capacity has gone up significantly. We're almost at 260,000 tests a day capacity right now. So the idea that we have not been making a difference.
350,000 at the end of June. It's not increased since the end of June.
Well, the capacity has indeed gone up, and if you look at where
as we've talked about many times on this programme, capacity is very different to the number of people actually being tested. Ed,
I think people are going to be extremely worried at the moment. They're going to be worried that there could be a second lockdown, and worried that the government's strategy on testing, tracing, isolation just isn't working. And that's true, Alok. We've seen the testing, how that's been sending people to other parts of the country. But on the isolation point that you make, Fiona, that Tia made, people aren't being checked up on. And the report that you quoted, you've got to ask why people aren't isolating when they've been asked to. First of all, they aren't being checked up on. Secondly, people who are desperate to go to work, they're not giving any support payments to stay at home. In Germany, they are. They're encouraged, so their financial loss is being recompensed. There's no strategy. Let me finish, if I may, Alok. You've got no real strategy on that, nothing like the Germans have got. The Germans are being far more successful with you. And there's another issue that we've got to remember. I think the public lost a lot of trust in the government earlier in this pandemic. When Dominic Cummings broke the lockdown rules and it paid no price for that, that sent a really bad message. And if you're surprised that people out there aren't following all the rules, Alok, I think you need to talk to your Prime Minister. And you just need to say to him, why did he not pull up Dominic Cummings? There can't be one rule for us and one rule for Boris Johnson's friends.
Sherry, you've had your hand up a long time.
Just with regard to the increasing restrictions, it seems to be every few days more and more restrictions are coming in. I think a lot of confidence in the government's long-term strategy has been lost because red lines haven't been laid out. Everybody senses we're going in the direction of a second lockdown, but with the recent push towards moving people to go back to the office to work, which has now been reversed. People are now being encouraged to work from home. There's very little confidence that despite the government saying we'll endeavour to keep schools open, that's our priority, I, as a parent of a school-age child, have no confidence that that's going to pan out. How can we see an evidence-based approach in the government policies?
Well, in terms of restrictions moving on and developing every few days, as you mentioned, Sherry, let's take a question on exactly that from Linda.
Hi, good evening. My question is regarding Christmas.
Oh, yes, Christmas seems to be cancelled, doesn't it, Linda? We're not quite sure what's happening with Christmas. Go on.
Well, shall I book a Christmas lunch in a pub on tables of 6 in separate names in order to be able to see all my children and grandchildren together, as it is probably and hopefully the next time we can all be together as a family?
Is Christmas off, Ed?
Well, I really hope it isn't. It's so important for families to come together. But we're only going to save Christmas if the government get their act together. We've been asking, the Labour Party's been asking them, the opposition parties have been asking them to sort out test trace nicely. I'm sorry to come back to that, but it's failed for many reasons. Let me give you another reason. In many other countries, like Korea, like Taiwan, like Germany, the government has trusted the local authorities, the councils, the local public health officials, and worked with them. They've been part of a team. In this government, it's been all centralised, it's been Whitehall run. Sometimes local councils haven't been given any information until just at the last minute. Right. That is just not acceptable. And if you talk to officials in public health, they're pretty cross, because this was a basic tenet of public health policy in a pandemic, that you should have a team approach, that you should have a locally based approach. And if you did contact tracing locally, properly, rather than it done through a central call system with all your private contractors who are getting all these nice juicy contracts, I tell you what, it would work just like it's working well in other countries.
So of course this is the rule of 6, and Devi, you're doing things slightly differently in Scotland. It's the rule of 6, but different households cannot meet, which is going to create all sorts of problems for Linda if that comes down to England and is still hanging around at Christmas. What is it that you know, or that you think you know in Scotland, that means that different households shouldn't meet, that isn't known or is being done differently in England?
Well, I think the scientific advice is pretty similar across all the 4 nations and actually across many countries across the world. In the end, these are political decisions and trade-offs of actually what are you going to emphasize and how are you going to manage this infection.
So why do you think Scotland has taken that approach then?
Well, I think the tracing system is quite robust here, and what they've found is that many of the clusters are coming from households and indoor hospitality, not hospitality, but indoor homes. House parties has been a big problem as well, and so they're trying to break those chains of transmission. They're just in now for 3 weeks. These kind of restrictions were put into the west of Scotland a few weeks back and managed to move the exponential growth into linear growth, so slightly kind of getting a handle on that, and the idea is hopefully that can do the same for the rest of the country.
Kieran?
I think the thing that brings all of these things together is the test, track and trace. And the thing that's been sort of most seen in the news over the last couple of weeks is just how much of a shambles the testing system is in. People can't get a test. And when you can't get a test, you can't tell how many people in the country are getting the virus or catching the virus. When you can't tell who those people are, you can't tell them to isolate. You then can't track their non-contacts, and the virus then is out of control again. So I think we need to start to fix the testing system so that we can track thereafter and trace thereafter. It's really, really important. And if we don't fix the testing system at the moment, then, I fear that, yes, we are going to face a second lockdown. And yes, Christmas is going to be cancelled. And I really, really hope that both of those things aren't true. But my fear is they are.
And Peter, you didn't wait for the England and Wales app, which has been launched today. Obviously, Northern Ireland was much earlier, and Scotland a few weeks earlier too. You went ahead and did your own app.
Well, we did our own app originally because we wanted to be COVID safe and to enable people to order food and drink on their app. But we very quickly realised that was the way to solve the track and trace. Yeah. So we were able to do it. So every time a customer now comes in, once they've registered on our app, we know they're there. So that if we were to be contacted by the government and said, look, so-and-so was in your pub, we could work out who they might have had any form of contact with.
So why didn't you wait? Did you just give up on the government then, in terms of the tracing app?
Well, it was a bit confusing. I mean, I think in the show I remember the show in May, poor old Stephen Buckley, confirmed that it would be coming out the following week, and it was sort of 4 months on. So, it was a hell of a big gap. But no, we had a responsibility to record our customers, and it was just the best and easiest way of doing it. And then people who didn't have telephones, then we just took it manually on a pad. So we've always complied. Indeed, we helped the government form the regulations, and we even did the Cabinet Office Public Information Fund. So, and I do think people should support the government with these rules in every way they can. Because
are you worried about the effect on Christmas in terms of bookings?
Well, yes, but I think there's a wider tragedy. If kind of everyone's been using some motive term of Christmas is going to be cancelled, and I mean clearly it's not. It's just going to be different. I mean, I don't think it'll be possible for the government to allow large office parties and stuff. So we just have to suck that up. That's probably not going to happen this year. But I think it'd be a real shame if families can't get together at Christmas time. So let's hope that the measures being put in place will work, and sure, perhaps some more detailed local action, because I think that's what is needed rather than this kind of centralised command and control, same rule for all parts of the country. I think just to look at the detail. Because I think what we've had, if you compare, the Treasury, have got this great execution, everything they do, and on the health side, not so good. They sort of failure to execute. They just need to get on top of it.
Louise.
Well, Linda, you've got a much bigger family than mine. I think I can fit my whole family and probably all my mates on one table in one group of 6 in for Christmas.
Louise, that's absolutely dreadful. Not so much the family, but the mates.
Yeah.
Sympathy. You kept us for Christmas.
But look, again, I don't want to sound like a broken record like Ed, but it really is getting test, trace and isolate fixed. Yeah. Back in, and this isn't with the benefit of hindsight. The World Health Organization was very clear back in March, as we were watching the virus come from China, come through Italy, come to this country, that system was necessary as a backbone in our public health response, and the government stopped tracking and tracing back in April. They didn't ramp up testing capacity to where it needed to be, and this is where we are now. The public, I think, are incredibly sympathetic. They understand this is very difficult, but actually it's pretty simple what's needed to be done, and it's unforgivable that the government is where it is now. The virus is an act of God, but the incompetence and the failure to address it lies squarely with the government.
There's lots of hands up. I'm going to very quickly get around as many of you as I can. Alan.
What's the measures that are going to be taken if Christmas is actually cancelled? The effect on mental health for the country is going to be very, very hard, especially for older people. And the worry I have is that this is just going to build on top of all the worries they have for everything else that's happening.
Peggy.
Hi, there's been many references to other parts of the world, especially Asia. I was actually in Southeast Asia in January for a holiday as a family there, and since I've returned, they've been following my lockdown, through Zoom and through the telephone, and I've been observing theirs, and they went through a harder lockdown, but now they're mainly recovered and they're getting about their own lives. And to the question about hospitality, because there's been restrictions and people traveling abroad, lots of their hotels are now fully booked from local people traveling, trying to make the most out of being just in the country itself. So I fully really echo what Devi is saying about there's actually no conflict in balancing public health and also the economy.
Elliot.
Yeah, it was just to add some of the points that Kieran made and some of the panels made about the failures of testing. I think a large part of the failure is with the privatisation of testing. We talk about NHS testing, but in many cases it's not the NHS who are testing. A family friend had to pay £175 to get a test, and they did have coronavirus. If they weren't in a position to pay the £175, that would have been somebody who wouldn't be able to get access to a test otherwise, and would have been going about society unaware that they had coronavirus. So just adding to that, and you're mentioning the impact of privatisation and testing as well.
I mean, Alok, no government wants to be cast in the role of the Grinch, obviously. And Boris Johnson said he very much hopes things can get, that we can get together at Christmas, but he can't promise. How when you listen to Linda, says she can't even. Linda, you've obviously got a massive family. Congratulations. But the idea of getting all together at the moment, if the rule of 6 continues, is just a non-starter.
Well, of course, I would like Linda and all of us to be able to enjoy time with our families at Christmas. But can I just go back to this point about where we are now compared to March? We're in a quite different place because of the actions the government's taken, actually because lots of people across the country have shown an enormous amount of common sense. We've managed over the months to get this under control, and we have managed to open up the economy in a big way. So you've seen the last 3 months, the economy started to recover, consumer confidence has returned.
But do you think coronavirus is under control now in this country?
Well, obviously, the infection rates have been rising, and that's why we have introduced these new measures, and we want people to follow them. But what I am sort of really quite concerned about is when I hear from Louise and Ed this sort of constant criticism. Of course, we should be held to account and we should get things right. But when Louise's colleague, the Shadow Education Secretary, talked about the fact that Labour shouldn't miss out on a good crisis, I mean, that really is quite unacceptable. This is a global pandemic. All of us need to work together, and we want to see constructive opposition, not people just carping from the sidelines. I mean, that's not what the public wants at all.
I think that's really unfair on the Labour Party.
Briefly, because I need to get another question.
And the opposition. We've been actually supportive of the government on many measures. It's our job to hold you account, Alok, when you make mistakes. And everyone knows you're making a real mistake on the testing, tracing and isolation system. The facts are there. And Alan's point about people, elderly people, maybe suffering from mental health. If you look at our care homes, you know, there's a lot of people who've got dementia in those care homes, and because the care homes haven't had the testing for their staff and their residents and visitors, some of those elderly people, their conditions have worsened. This is the impact of not getting testing right. It's serious, and it's affecting many people across our country.
I want to get one more question in, particularly given developments today, which is from Alex Buckmaster.
Why can I return from a foreign holiday, quarantine, and see my family at Christmas, but I can't from university?
Right, now, Devi, I'm going to come to you on this because obviously events have happened here in Scotland today. Hundreds, over 1,000 at least, students self-isolating at universities in Scotland. There are also some in Liverpool and possibly elsewhere by now. And what we're hearing is that because of the rules in Scotland, different households not mixing, students at universities in Scotland cannot go home, are going to be banned from pubs and restaurants and may not go home for Christmas. What's going on?
Well, I can only speak to the scientific advice and kind of the perspective from public health, which is that we've seen the scenario play out in the United States over the past 6 to 8 weeks. A lot of students come back, movement of people across the country or even across the world into cramped kind of student living, which means it's very hard to keep separate with shared bathrooms, you know, shared kitchens. And then adding on top of that, you have an age group who wants to socialize, who wants to be around each other and are least likely to comply with rules, which they feel are most restrictive on them, but least beneficial. And I guess,
Devi, let me ask you then, as a global public health expert, do you think, given how quickly this has happened, I mean, Scottish universities have been back more or less for a fortnight now, do you think they should have come back at all?
I think they should have only come back under strict guidelines. I've done an article 8 weeks ago and I asked for testing on arrival, testing after 5 days to make sure you catch all cases, you know, regular testing on campuses, you know, ventilation, bubbling, you know, all the different measures you would have in place to make a campus what we might call COVID safe. And it just seems that, I mean, that's all I guess I can do as an academic is lay out as my perspective on what could make campuses go back safely. And then it's a choice for, you know, how you actually implement those.
Well, we've got some students amongst, as Charles would have it, amongst our audience. Let's hear from Sinem. You've got your hand up. You're starting your first year. You're a fresher, effectively.
I am, yes. And I'd just like to say, young people like myself are being blamed for the second spike in COVID-19. And hearing, for example, Matt Hancock's condescending comment on, and I quote, "Don't kill your grandma by catching coronavirus and passing it on," is very frustrating because the youth has been instructed to eat out to help out. We've been told to go back to school, and that is exactly what we've done. Yet we are still the ones being blamed.
Tia, you're starting your first year as well.
Yeah, so I'm starting my first year and I've been told that universities are returning for young people's mental health, which I fully understand, and I think that's extremely important, obviously. But the fact is that we're returning to university physically for 4 hours. So I have 8 hours of lessons a week, 4 hours of which are currently face-to-face. So basically I'm going and exposing myself to so many other people from all different parts of the country being brought together, sharing a kitchen. I know like some of the halls share a kitchen and toilets with like 10 people. So we're being asked to come together for what is essentially 4 hours of face-to-face a week because we're not allowed to socialise. So I don't think that's massively beneficial for our mental health either, especially now. I haven't yet gone to university and now I'm being told if you go, you might not be able to come home for Christmas. So that leaves me with the decision of, do I like save my mental health now, which apparently going to university will, or do I stay away so that I can actually stay with my family and see people more often than just 4 hours a week and be at home for Christmas?
Well, Tia, those are horrible decisions that you are having to make. I feel for you, I have to say, hearing that. Louise, I mean, Labour has supported the government in trying to make sure that education continues. Seeing what is happening more in Scotland, I guess Scotland's ahead of England, particularly. Is this the right approach?
Well, look, we've been incredibly constructive towards the government and have attempted to support them in all the measures to tackle the virus because it's not helpful for the public to hear different public health responses according to party lines.
But in terms of universities in particular?
Schools, I mean, we supported schools reopening. We want to see students going back to university, but again, with millions of students moving across the country, it was always going to be there was always going to be an increased demand for testing. There needed to be clear guidance in order to make, as Devi said, campuses COVID secure, and there needed to be a proper track and trace system underpinning that.
Well,
this was really quite inevitable, wasn't it?
Where we are, do you think it is right that students who are, we're not sure yet what's going to happen in England, but students in Scotland, for example, won't be able to go home?
I think it's grossly unfair, isn't it, to tell students that they can return to university,
but is it
then
right?
To tell them, no, I don't think it is right. I don't think it is right that we're asking students to return to university, their first time living away from home, then being told they can't go out and socialise and potentially not return home to their families. You know, Tia said that's about improving your mental health. I imagine that being incredibly deteriorating for your mental health.
Ed?
It's incredibly tough on these students, and let's remember there was an added problem for them and the universities. Because of the way the government mishandled the exam system, they ended up having to allow more people to be able to go to university. And that was very late in the day. So universities have been really struggled, even they've got massive financial problems, to make their campuses and their accommodation COVID secure. And suddenly there was a massive impact, increase in students because of the incompetence over the A-levels system. So the government have made it even more difficult for universities, even more difficult for students. And again, I don't see apologies, I don't see them taking action, giving more support to the universities who are having to struggle with this. And Alok, you know, this has got public health implications. And you can't just allow universities and students just to fend for themselves. They need extra support. I don't see why they're not getting it.
Peter?
Well, a number of points there. I mean, I'm not an expert in education, but I think what's clear is that young people were always going to mingle and there was always going to be transmission. And then it's whether you're of the view that it's relatively safe and, you know, they are a long way from granny, so you could perhaps even argue this is the time for them to get it. But then the point is, I guess, students go elsewhere. I guess it needed there to be a plan. And I think schools have the problem as well. I got a letter today from, an email, sorry, from a guy who sits on the parents', you know, he's a board of governors. And he was making the point that he's got teachers kind of having to do COVID cleans and putting all the measures in, and they're really struggling to stay on top and to deliver teaching at home for the kids that can't come in. And they need more resources. So, you know, I was able to pay for extra cleaning and extra measures because I'm a business. And I think maybe it might help if the government can look at how they can support to work out the right protocol and to provide some extra funding for schools and, if need be, universities to help them deliver a kind of safe environment.
So, Alok, what's the plan then? If we see repeat, I mean, there's already been an outbreak in Liverpool, I think 87 cases. If we see in England what's happening in Scotland, I say we're just a couple of weeks behind, what's the plan?
Well, look, I think the first thing I happily acknowledge that it has been a tough time for young people. I have two daughters who are university age, and it has been a very tough time for them. But going back to this point about making sure that students are, if they're able to go to university, younger children to be able to be in school, I think that's really important for their mental health being, and I think it's really important in terms of their development. We are working with the university sector to ensure that they have the advice in terms of keeping premises safe. And going back to this point,
can you see a situation happening in England as it's happening in Scotland, where university students are not allowed to go home?
Well,
not allowed to go to the pub.
I hope we really don't get to that, but that does require.
But is that in your planning at the moment? That's what I'm asking.
We've always said that, and we've said this right from the start of this pandemic, is that we keep all options on the table and under review. But the point now is that we want people to follow the rules and the guidance that we put in place now. And if we're able to do that, we will be able to get this under control and we will come out the other side.
I mean, you were a fresher once, Alok.
I was.
I mean, you remember what that was like.
Ago.
Well, you remember what that was like, I'm sure. I mean, how realistic is it to expect people, when they go to university away from home for the first time, to say, you know, nice to meet you, I'm staying 2 metres away from literally everybody?
No, Fiona, it is, of course, very difficult. But actually, from what I've observed, young people are also very responsible. They understand the reason that we ask people to follow the guidance and the rules. And going back to the support for universities, we are making financial support for universities available. Obviously, they will have less foreign students coming, so that support is being provided. So this idea that somehow we are leaving the sector unsupported, I don't think that's fair.
Alex, you asked the question. What do you think about what you've heard?
I think what Alok said about how going to university helps your mental health, me not going home for Christmas is so much worse than me going to university.
Oh, it's so much worse than you not going to university, you mean?
Yeah, I would have just stayed home, because I'm in my second year, I would have just stayed home and done all of my course online, which I'm basically doing anyway. I'm having all but 2 hours of online lectures. And I would have just stayed home and had Christmas with my family, because I'm my mum's only son. My dad has cancer this year, and they've had such a difficult year. And now for them to know, considering in the Sage Minutes on the 1st September, they knew the risk of high education infection, for them just to say now, oh, there's a chance you will miss Christmas after all they have been through, it's just unacceptable.
Well, look, Alex, I hope that doesn't happen. And I'm terribly sorry about, obviously, your father as well. And Tia and Sina, you're starting your first year. Good luck with that. Our hour is up, I'm afraid. I think we could talk about this for quite some time. Tonight, all our questions came from Chingford. Thank you very much to you. And next week, we'll have our virtual audience from Carlisle. The week after that, we will be in Coventry. So if you live in the cities or even in the area around Carlisle or Coventry, please get in touch, because we really want to hear what you've got to say. I think the next few weeks are certainly going to be interesting, challenging. We shall see what happens. You can apply by going to the Question Time website and follow the instructions there. As I say, we'd love to hear from you. Adrian, Charles and guests, as always, are on 5 Live now with Question Time Extra Time, and you can see on the screen how to get in touch by phone, by text or by tweet. But for now, thank you very much to our panel for coming here tonight. Devi, thank you very much for joining us down the line. And of course, thank you to all of you, to the audience here in Chingford, for joining in the programme. And thanks to you, as always, for watching. From Question Time, bye.